For most of my life, anxiety was something that I'd never even fully understood. I obviously heard about it. I knew a lot of people that had had it and were struggling with it, but because I never experienced it myself, I just felt like, wow, that must be tough and it must be something difficult to go through. And then it happened for the first time. And I remember that I knew that as soon as it happened and as soon as it was happening, because it happened for quite some time, I knew what everyone was talking about. And I knew this would be impossible to ever forget, just because of how intense it was. Anxiety was the first thing I had ever experienced in a negative connotation, if you want to call it, that completely took over my entire experience of life. It took over my ability to think. It took over my ability to breathe. It took over my ability to function with my body. It took over my ability to, interact with other people. It completely took over what you can call the driver's seat of my existence in the time when it decided to strike. And for me, I'll never forget that night. It was triggered by me having to be somewhere in the morning. And I remember I had to go, at the time I wanted to be an actor. I really wanted to. It's just something I always wanted to do as a kid. And I had booked a shoot to go work somewhere. Started early the next morning. I was out of town. I had to drive there early with a couple of other people. I think I had to leave. It was around 4 or 5 in the morning that I would have to wake up and leave. So I knew I wanted to get to bed early. And I didn't want to go tired because I was going to be there for several days doing the shoot. And it was important to me. And the character was something I cared about a lot. And the day was going fine prior to that. But then at some point, something just kicked in the sense of, what if I don't get to sleep? Or if I'm really tired, I need to do this, and this is important to me, and I can't do it. I mean, I've had thoughts like that in the past, but suddenly this time, that was enough of a trigger to kick into something else. Something that I didn't initially know was anxiety, but it quickly ran its course, and it was something that I was quickly able to identify as anxiety itself. And I remember being there that night, and I was lucky enough to have loved ones around me that, wanted to provide support and were trying to figure out what was going on with me as much as I was. I just suddenly couldn't relax. Even just trying to lay down. I mean, we've all been restless or incapable of falling asleep before, but even just the idea of laying down or sitting up on the couch was insanely uncomfortable. I couldn't sit still. I didn't know how to process what was going on within me. You compound that with the fact that I knew I needed to be somewhere soon, somewhere I actually wanted to be, something that every part of me in the past would have been excited to be a part of. I now suddenly started to fear. I was afraid. I actually didn't want to go. I started thinking of ways I could get out of it, anything to provide me for relief from this experience I was going through. But even that stuff, when I started to think of the potential outs, which there were some if I really wanted to be, there always are, weren't going to provide relief to this. This was something that was consuming my entire being. It was consuming everything within me, and I'd never experienced it like that before. And this was clearly anxiety. And I remember that night was going on, and I don't remember ever falling asleep properly. I remember dozing in and out casually every once in a while, but it was always waking in a real frantic state, and it was still very prevalent within my body, and it was always made even worse by fear itself. It was just always there. And I remember the morning came, or the time when I had to go for the actual shoot itself, and I forced myself to go. And I was afraid, and my loved ones were there too, and they were concerned as well. And I remember they were checking in on me, and I happened to also be the one who volunteered to drive, well, not only myself, but a couple others from the area. And I remember that drive felt like it took forever. And that entire shoot when I was out there, something that I'd always loved doing suddenly felt so difficult. Because even when the anxiety wasn't really strong and taking over my ability to do anything, this fear of it was there. This fear of like, how would if it becomes like that? And now I have people I don't know as well around me. What are they going to think about me? What is this going to cost me? What's this going to create for me? And I was in this state of torment. And it was almost like something within me really wanted to create a challenge for me. Because not only was this challenging enough and needing to be around a bunch of people that I didn't really know that well, some of which I hadn't even met before, but on top of that, we were filming in the middle of the woods in this really dingy cabin and stuff like that, where it wasn't that dirty. And when it wasn't that dirty, it wasn't that clean. And at the end of the night, we were in this space where there wasn't even enough space for everyone. I ended up having to sleep in my car. And I remember I was sleeping in my car with the 2 other guys I drove up with. So it was like even more out of my element. It was all these things that were really making it uncomfortable. And I remember even that night when I was trying to fall asleep in my car, when I was already physically exhausted, but dealing with all these fears and all these things going on, it was like every time I did manage to fall asleep, I would have dreams about the anxiety. And it was like it was there, and I would always wake up in states of torment. This thing was like consuming my entire life. And it was just like, how could I have experienced all of my life to this point without it? And suddenly this thing was there, and I felt like this is going to be here forever. I have no idea what to do about it, because even when it's not there, there's a fear of it. And this kind of started my entire journey with anxiety. And believe it or not, as intense as this experience was, this was just scratching the surface. I ended up having anxiety be triggered by a whole bunch of things, and sometimes be a lot more extensive than this. My most extensive battle with it was actually a time when anxiety persisted within me for an entire week. It was 1 week of consistent anxiety presence. It never went away. And for me, my anxiety always started with a feeling in the back of my head, but then it would obviously transform into a whole bunch of things from that. But it was actually there for an entire week with this whole feeling. And I remember I was barely able to sleep. I was barely able to eat. And I remember even telling a couple of my loved ones that I was with at the time, who was trying to support me and trying to provide, who I'm incredibly grateful for that they were there. I literally told them that I think this is going to be the end. That it's going to be with me until that end comes, because I'm out of things to do. I don't know what to do about this. And I remember I just felt so helpless. And I kind of reached this pit, and the people were trying to do everything they could, even doing like energy work and all these different things, anything that they can get their hands on to try and assist with this process. But it's like I was getting to this depth of despair, and it was an entire week of it where I couldn't go to work anymore. I couldn't even interact with my friends anymore. I had bouts with shame, with confusion. It was triggering everything, all things I had felt isolated before, but it was now being compounded by this one main experience of anxiety, which on its own was insanely physically stimulating in an unpleasant way. And it was just ridiculous. And I remember even when that 1 week period, I can say, finally came to an end, and I remember driving away because I ended up staying at my dad's place for the entire week. Driving away, the fear was still there. All this stuff was still there. I still didn't feel like I was the same person. And this didn't feel right to me, because I knew what life was like without it. And even though it wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things or in the bigger picture of life, it felt like it was forever ago. And my life without it was becoming more and more distant, and I didn't want to lose sight of it, because I felt like that's the life I wanted to step back into. I wanted to step back into the power of not being afraid of this thing that has thrust itself upon me. So I became obsessed with this idea of finding a solution to anxiety. And of course, I'm not the first person to ever go through anxiety, especially at that point. There are so many resources available, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. So I started going through stuff at crazy rates. I started reading tons of books related to anxiety. I watched tons of videos related to anxiety. I went to meet with a bunch of practitioners. I listened to some seminars, some online videos, all these different things. I was just digesting everything. That's the way I am. I'm obsessive with things, and anxiety forced itself into becoming one of my obsessions, because it took over everything. It ruined everything else I loved. I couldn't think of any of my other obsessions because everything was anxiety now, or everything was a fear of anxiety. So it forced me to become obsessed with it. So I started just digesting all these things, trying all these weird techniques that I remember most of them when I would first look at them, I'd be like, this is the stupidest thing ever. But I tried it, and some of them ended up being things that I love so much that I created variations of them for this course because they worked for me so well. So I just went through everything, and I know that we all, as people, don't have the time to go through that, don't have the time to go through that much stuff, but there are so many of us that unfortunately are faced with forms of anxiety, some maybe even more extreme than I have. I'm sure there are some more extreme than I have. And because of that, I wanted to make it as simple as possible to help as many people as possible alleviate themselves from it, because I now know, being in the position I am now, and it was an exhaustive process, and it was a very lengthy process, and there was a lot of trial and error within it, that you can refine that power where you no longer are, number one, thrust within the anxiety and caught within it, and number two, afraid of it. Because for most of us, that's a reality that feels impossible to experience or impossible to ever go through again, just because of how intense anxiety can be when it's there and when it feels like it's still threatening within us, or when it's alive within us and it's still thriving within some part of us. So that's why I created this course, to share what personally worked for me, what I've also used to help other people, friends, family, other people I've connected with that have contacted me through my other work, to kind of express their own experience with anxiety, because I wanted to help people, to help them too. And I've seen these things help them in the moment. Some of these things to help address the anxiety, change the way you're looking at it in the first place, and then things to actually do something about it when it's actively happening. These are the ones that really stood out for me. And I want to provide that relief for as many people as possible, because I think anxiety has managed to hack its way into our lives. So why not hack anxiety right back out, right? I think that we have the ability to do that. And this course is designed to kind of empower them. That's why I wanted to create it, to share it with as many of you as possible, because I know how shitty life can be when anxiety is there and it's running its course within you, and how freeing can be without it. And am I suggesting that you're never going to have anxiety kind of creep up and try and show itself to you? No, but it's about building a strength within you that when it does, it's nothing to be afraid of anymore. It's something that you know you're bigger than, something that you know you're in control of and you're always in the driver's seat of.